Hello, and welcome back to Fabric of a Revolution, Recreating a 13-Star American Flag. I'm Holly, a fiber artist and your host, and this is the last episode in this series. So if you haven't watched the previous episodes, I would encourage you to go back where I go through the steps of taking raw materials of wool and flax and creating everything I need to sew a 13-star American flag in the fashion of the first American flags. Having been fortunate enough to see an original 18th century flag in person at the Commonwealth Museum in Boston, I was able to look carefully at how it was all put together. Remember that the sewing machine was not invented until the mid-1800s, so all the seams were hand-sewn with 2-ply hand-spun linen thread with 2 lines of stitching between the stripes and 3 lines of stitching around the blue field. It appears that the seams were done as welt seams. The raw edges of the fabric pieces are folded into each other and then sewn through all layers of the folded fabric. The construction of this type of seam encases the raw edges of the fabric so they don't fray. The linen stars were appliqued onto both sides of the blue field. This means the linen stars were sewn on top of the blue fabric, with their raw edges folded under before sewing. This flag is going to take a lot of hand stitching, and I tried to get myself an assistant, but he kept laying down on the job, so I guess it's up to me. Now, while I sew, let's talk about who would have been making flags in America during the time of the American Revolution. When you think about who sewed the first American flag, you might think of Betsy Ross. Or perhaps, maybe you've come across this tale of how Captain John Paul Jones was presented a flag for the Ranger that had been made from the best silk gowns of the ladies of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Jones furnished the specifications, and, as the story goes, the work was done at a quilting party, and the white stars were cut from the bridal dress of one Helen Seary. Or you may have heard this story. It was recorded in 1860 and recounts the making of a flag out of necessity on the eve of the siege at Fort Schuyler in New York, August 1777. The garrison was also without a flag when the enemy appeared, but their pride and ingenuity soon supplied one in conformity to the pattern adopted by the Continental Congress. Shirts were cut up to form the white stripes, bits of scarlet cloth were joined for the red, and the blue ground for the stars was composed of a cloth cloak belonging to Captain Abraham Swartwout of Dutchess County, who was then in the fort. The stories we tell, especially when orally transferred, contain information viewed by the tellers as important. And like most legends, the stories of flag makers passed down through the centuries are not entirely devoid of truth. So let's take a look at the existing primary information to see what we can learn. Let's start with Betsy Ross. By the end of her life, after the death of 2 husbands and her subsequent remarrying, her full name was Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool. But in 1776, she was still Betsy Ross. The story of her consulting with George Washington to design the first American flag was recorded by her grandson in an address to the Pennsylvania Historical Society almost 100 years after the American Revolution in 1870. According to the research of historian Marla Miller, the archival record of Betsy Ross is slim at best. We know she worked at the upholstery shop of Mr. John Webster in Philadelphia, starting her employment in 1767 when she was just 15. It was not uncommon for 3 to 4 women to be employed to do sewing work in upholstery shops, but they were not considered apprentices. It was under the employment of Mr. Webster that she met her first husband, John Ross. Together they set out in 1773 to open their own upholstery shop. When her first husband died in 1776, she continued the business. As far as her making flags at her upholstery shop, there is one existing record that shows Elizabeth Ross was paid £14, 12 shillings, 2 pence for the making of ship's colors. I know it is a bit of a tangent, but while we are talking about Betsy Ross, let's try to answer a question that I often hear bantered about. Can Betsy Ross be credited for designing the stars and stripes that become our nation's flag? Some suspect the credit goes to Frances Hopkinson, but the evidence seems inconclusive. Let's take a look at what we know. Hopkinson served as a delegate to represent New Jersey at the Second Continental Congress, which met from 1775 to 1781. The Continental Congress approved the design of the national flag on June 14, 1777. Hopkinson was the chair of the Marine Committee at the time, so it is conceivable he may have been involved in approving a common flag for all ships in the Continental Navy. But did he design it? In 1780, he wrote to Congress to ask for compensation for exerting his small abilities of artistic design for public service, listing his contributions as the flag of the United States of America, 7 devices for the continental currency, a seal for the Board of Treasury, ornaments, devices, and checks for the new bills of exchange in Spain and Holland, a seal for the ship's papers of the United States, a seal for the Board of Admiralty, the borders, ornaments, and checks for the new continental currency, now in the press, a work of considerable length, and a great seal for the United States of America with a reverse. His designs for a great seal for the United States of America have been preserved, but they are not the ones that were the final choice for the official seal. Perhaps his designs for the flag were not the final designs either. Without more information, we can't be sure. The response recorded in the Journal of the Continental Congress says, with respect to the charges of the works incidental to the Treasury, the said Frances Hopkinson was not the only person consulted on those exhibitions of fancy, and therefore cannot claim the sole merit of them, and is not entitled in this respect to the full sum charged. So, while Frances Hopkinson was involved in the flag design, I think we must acknowledge that it, like all good things in democracy, was a collaborative effort. All right, now let's get back to sewing. But Betsy was not alone in sewing flags. The upholstery profession was well suited to making flags, as they also made and sewed a number of other utilitarian objects, such as beds, bedding, curtains, blinds, mattresses, chair covers, sofas, and other items. And Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, seems to have been a hub of upholsterers making military supplies. This makes sense, seeing as the Continental Congress was meeting there at the time. Looking through the digitized newspaper collection held by the Library of Congress, one can find multiple advertisements from the time of the Revolution placed by various upholsterers selling colors. Some, like Rebecca Young, seem to specialize in flags. She ran these 2 advertisements numerous times in 1781 and 1782, saying she made all kinds of colors for the Army and Navy, and sometimes asking, any person having bunting for sale may hear of a purchaser by applying as above. One of the most prominent upholsterers of Philadelphia, a Mr. Fleeson, advertised in 1775 that he continues to make and prepare drums and colors. And then there was William Martin, whose ads say that he is particularly bred to that branch requisite to finish field and camp equipage, including colors. The most complete story I could put together of an upholsterer involved in making flags was that of George Houghton, From his newspaper advertisements, he seems to have arrived from London before 1775, already having completed his apprenticeship in upholstery. In this ad in Dunlop's Pennsylvania Packet, 1775, he states that having already done principal work sometime in this city for Mr. Webster, he intends to open his own shop to follow the upholstery business in all its various branches. Incidentally, this is the same John Webster that Betsy Ross worked for. Just a year later, in January of 1776, he advertises that from his shop on First Street, he continues to make all kinds of upholstery furniture in the genteelest manner and at the most reasonable rates. Likewise, he makes and sells every article in the military way, such as drums, colors, and so on. In May 1776, he moves his shop to a new location in Philadelphia, to the house next to the London Coffee House on Front Street, where he continues to sell every article in the upholstery business, including colors and other articles necessary to the military. So clearly there were many professional artisans making and selling flags in their shops to the military. But what about the stories of people making flags from what they have on hand? As for the story of Helen Seary's wedding dress being used for the stars on a flag for the ship's captain John Paul Jones, a captain of the Continental Navy, I could find no evidence of such an event. However, with the help of some very skillful librarians and archivists, uncovering support for the story of the 1777 Fort Schuyler flag was more successful. Recall that a tale had been recorded in the mid-1800s of a flag being made in haste to fly over Fort Schuyler when the enemy approached. The importance of having a flag was to communicate which side of the conflict occupied the fort, in this case, the American forces. The flag was reportedly constructed from cloth they had on hand. For the red stripes, they used bits of scarlet cloth, or women's red flannel petticoats, as I have also seen the story told. But through all the various retellings, the common thread is always Captain Abraham Stoutwart's blue cloak. Indeed, there is an existing letter from Captain Swartwout, dated 29 August 1778. The letter reads, "You may remember, agreeable to your promise, I was to have an order for 8 yards of broadcloth on the commissary for clothing of this state in lieu of my blue cloak, which was used for colors at Fort Schuyler." So, did the soldiers sit around with needle and thread? While men like upholsterers and tailors, and possibly others, would have known how to sew, I imagine the soldiers were busy getting ready for the battle at hand. Were there others at the fort too? According to William Colbrath's journal, an ensign at the fort during the time, the ladies with children as well as sick and wounded soldiers were evacuated to safety at Fort Dayton in late July. However, there is evidence that women were still present at the fort into August. Again, from William Colbrath's journal, as he mentions a woman, no name, being slightly wounded on August 15th. Did these women residing at the fort join together in solidarity to sew a flag from gathered materials in only 24 hours? I guess we'll never be sure, but it is the version of the story that I will keep with me. With a great deal of uncertainty about the making of those early flags, perhaps we can tell our own story, a story of our time which speaks to what is important to us now, a story of all of us in this nation, with our diverse cultures and backgrounds and styles and ideas, all of us stitching together our nation and creating a symbol of unity, shared purpose, hope, and love for our country, a true representation of all of us. Well, here it is, the completed flag. I hope you've enjoyed this series and maybe learned a little something new along the way. If you're interested in seeing the flag in person, it will be on display at the Clapp Memorial Library in Belchertown, Massachusetts, from June 9th to June 30th. Thank you for joining me.